Good morning, Chairman. We're now live.
But I do hope everybody's well, and if we before we commence the meeting, obviously as members we've had a notification of the very sad news of Barry Young, our former chairman of this committee, has sadly passed away, and I thought it would be appropriate perhaps if we could have a minute's silence for Barry in view of his diligent service to the County Council and this committee. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, members. Return to Tom and request any apologies for absences. I do believe Adam can't be with us today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillor Stokes and Councillor King.
Thank you. And at item 2, members, we had declaration of members' interest. Do I have any declarations? No, thank you. And we have the minutes of our previous committee held on the 19th of June 2023. Could I have a proposer and seconder for their approval? Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Mark. And so we go to item 4, which is our... Sorry. I'll vote on this. I do apologise. Thomas is correcting me here. Could we please approve the minutes? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And if we could then turn to item 4, which is David, and it's our monitoring officer's annual report. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. This is my opportunity to report to the committee once a year what's been going on in the world of the monitoring officer. It's very much an information-based report, so I don't really have anything to add what's on the paper. What I would say is that I've been coming to the committee for several years now with this similar kind of paper, and I get the impression that I've been piling anecdote upon anecdote, especially in the section on the local government ombudsman report. And if it would be helpful to the committee, I would be happy to bring forward at one of its future meetings something which is a bit more analytical, perhaps putting the County Council's experience within the context of the annual Ombudsman's report and statistics so that you can get a feel for scale, a little bit more information about how we compare with other areas and maybe some trends over time, because I'm conscious that this, whilst I've been producing this report for several years now, it's probably not serving either your purpose or mine. So I'd welcome any feedback on that and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with you entirely. I think it is time perhaps to move on to that sort of format. It's quite illustrative in terms of what's happening, but I think what would be interesting is to look at some benchmarking or something like that to see how we compare across the piece. We seem to be doing all right, but we're not entirely sure. I think that is, or we don't have evidence that is exactly the case.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is a very good read. Perhaps because I'm an independent person into other councils, I read it through that sort of lens. But also from an educational background lens. And whilst the numbers of complaints and issues is small, in respect of the complaints against elected members, I was struck that 3 complaints for a council this size, when a certain other, not very far away, I've handled 10 complaints in a year, I do wonder whether there's sufficient awareness of the holding to account routes that are open to members of the public and or other councillors. But in respect of the Ombudsman ones, yes, it would be helpful to have a deeper analytical report on those. I endorse your actions in terms of policy reviews, staff training, culture awareness and development, etc. But of course, the key thing is that when particularly a child has not had a service that they might have expected and reasonably expected, cash can't compensate for that. And therefore, the fewer that you get of that nature, the better, in contrast to my curiosity about there being only 3 member complaints. So, yes, interesting read. I have to admit that compared to Michelle's forensic analysis of our financial position, I find that arguably a bit more interesting than some of that. But Michelle does her job in making it boring for us, because that's good in local government world, and there's an awful lot of authorities would love to have our boring accounts. But yes, I fully endorse your future reporting philosophy.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether that was a challenge to be a bit more boring in future. But yeah. It is a low number, but I think that reflects a bit of the culture in the organisation. So we don't get a lot of, or any generally member-on-member complaints, which I think is different to a number of other councils. I think the challenge as to whether the availability of the monitoring officer route is sufficiently well known is a fair one, and I can certainly take that away. I mean, the information is on the website, but it could be made more prominent, or we could do some work around that. So I think the challenge that a low number of complaints is not necessarily a good thing when this is precisely a process of holding people to account is fair comment.
So damned by faint praise by my colleague to my right. I think there's 2 things really for me. Number one is, it's like anything else in that, but if you make it too easy, you get an onslaught of people. I think the bigger thing for me is to understand if there is feedback through other channels that said we couldn't find it or get to it quickly. That is actually a bigger thing for me, because then if there aren't a lot of those, and there aren't those concerns, then people can at least access the system, and therefore 3 is a reasonable reflection. I think the other thing, like anything else I go into, would be the analytics, the so what question. So when we see some of these great anecdotes, absolutely endorsing the analytical review, the bit I'm looking for is what have we prevented? So where our lessons learned have changed attitudes or done something different, I'd like us to understand a little bit more about that. Because actually it's not the ones that we catch, it's the ones that we've avoided that's almost just as important. So I think analytics is great, but I think I'd like a little bit of confidence about stopping things as much as what we've found or been held to account for.
Thank you. I can certainly try and build some of that into a future report.
Thank you. I'm just interested, when I look at the Ombudsman complaints that you've put there, that quite a few come down to education and young people. And I seem to remember that might well have been the case for last year. I went to check it up before I came, but didn't. Is this something that we should be worried about, in that particular area? And I know it's not just necessarily the transport, there's the provision of educational health plans and so on, does seem to be coming up quite a lot, and it's whether something we should be taking notice of internally or not.
So I think there is something here about scale. So it is a small number of complaints where fault has been found. I did actually go back to last year's, because there was a discussion last year about the education and health care plans, and there were 3 Ombudsman's complaints upheld last year and 1 on that particular subject area this year, insofar as that's an indication of anything. I mean, the very nature of the Ombudsman, because they are investigating maladministration, which can be anything from, you know, a delay to a failure to respond appropriately, you do find that it's the kind of thing that could emerge at any time from almost any part of the council, depending on the circumstances. But again, I can have a look at whether there are areas of the council where complaints, and particularly upheld complaints, are massing, so that we can see whether there are any risk issues.
Just a bit of a follow-up. I wonder also whether, because it involves young people and children, whether the people behind the complaint are more likely to be making it than perhaps they might do for other matters. Taking it back to something we were saying a bit earlier on, do people really realise how much they can go on? I think in the educational world, when it's your child or your ward or the person you're looking after, you are really quite worked up quite often on their behalf, but I'm not always quite sure, other than adult social care, whether that would occur in other areas in quite the same way.
Yes, I mean, I think what would be interesting in that context is to put the ombudsman process into the context of the council's overall complaints process. So you could see the degree to which complaints, whether in children's or elsewhere, are actually being dealt with at an earlier stage, so that what you're seeing here is what has gone through the complaints process and failed to be resolved, and you know, that would be an interesting story in itself.
If I could just make a comment about the area that does seem to appear frequently in your report, both this year and last year, and it is the education and health plans that seem to cause some difficulty. I've been involved in three complaints that haven't obviously got to ombudsman stage. And from my knowledge of listening to both the parents' concerns and the county council's response, it's an exceptionally difficult area to deal with, because it's getting more and more difficult to provide opportunities for some of the youngsters that find it difficult to fit into a normal education regime, and it's getting more and more difficult for to make schools incorporate them into mainstream delivery as well, because they're finding it harder and harder to actually provide that sort of service within the school setting, and certainly parents get very frustrated about it, but it's quite exceptionally difficult sometimes to actually provide what you tend to end up with, which is home schooling, because the children don't want to be involved, basically, for whatever reason, and it does become very, very difficult then to provide, you know, an opportunity, and my sympathy goes out for the parents who are doing their utmost to try and find some form of education that they can provide for their children within the system that arises. But it is exceptionally difficult when a child does not want to engage in any way or form, you know, with the actual process that goes with education, in terms of, you know, sitting with somebody and being told what to do.
I couldn't endorse Councillor Allen's comments more strongly. I chair, in Derbyshire ICB, I chair the Commissioning for Individuals panel, which has a section on such children. It's horrendously expensive. But that brings me to the follow-up challenge to our monitoring officer. Education, health and care plans require two major public services to work nicely together. Are you getting the appropriate liaison, collaboration and responsiveness from the health services?
I'm afraid that's simply a question you'd have to ask to the children's services team. So what I see are the end processes, if you like, when things have reached the Ombudsman and the Ombudsman has expressed a view about them. What I don't have visibility of is the day-to-day liaison for all of those cases where things don't reach that stage.
I take that point, but could I ask that you prompt Glenn Garrett when he's next before us to perhaps address that collaborative liaison on education and health and care plans across education, social services and the care services?
Yeah, I think that would be Heather Sandy, but I can make your concerns aware to her. Yes.
Thank you, David. Any further questions for David? Perhaps I could ask one, David. Just regarding the Investigatory Powers Act. Obviously, we haven't used those powers in this in the term covered by this report. I mean, the use of covert intelligence. I mean, how is that relatively infrequent? And obviously, if you're making test purchases and things like that for trading standards, that's where one would naturally assume it would go. But in these days of you know, complicated surveillance that we hear on the media, do you have any instances of people of sort of tracking people's social media accounts and those sort of things? Or is that's not permitted? It's just your more traditional forms of intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, these numbers have been low for several years now, and it is trading standards who are the only people to do it. My understanding is that part of that is precisely because most of the activity is now online rather than otherwise, and therefore there are other methods that they use apart from having to seek these kinds of authorisations.
So generally those surveillances would at some point would be in conjunction with the police force, one suppose.
Sometimes, yes.
Sorry, I do apologise, I haven't got my microphone on. Thank you for that. If we could just move on to item 5, which is the update on the SIPFA Financial Management Code and Financial Resilience. Michelle, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So SIPFA introduced the Financial Management Code of Practice to support the demonstration of sound governance and financial management. Last September, we provided the committee with an update of our assessment against the code and the actions we needed to undertake, and that action list and an update on those are set out in Appendix A, which is in page 23 of your pack. There's been some slippage on those actions mainly due to the retirement of both the head of audit and the head of finance, whose replacements are now in place, I'm pleased to say. And it's also been compounded by the additional work required of the team on the accounts, which I know the committee are very au fait with, and the huge input that we've been required to put forward in terms of the implementation of the new Business World system, which went live in April. And some of those actions also need to align with the budget setting process, which culminates in Council in February. One of the actions that we identified last year was to invite an external review of our assessment and compliance with the code. Grant Thornton have undertaken that work, and their report is included at Appendix B, which is page 31. Overall, the Grant Thornton assessment was very similar to our own, identifying areas of good practice and areas for improvement, with an overall conclusion that the Council is operating in line with the requirements across all of the criteria in regard to the substance of the arrangements and also the spirit in which they are intended. With permission of the Chair, I'd like to invite Tom Foster to speak to the committee. Tom led the work for Grant Thornton and is on the team's call to provide an overview of to the committee of the work they completed and their findings, and then I'm sure Tom and I can take any questions if that's okay.
Good morning, everybody. So thanks for the introduction, Michelle. My name's Tom Foster. As mentioned, I led the work that was done earlier this year to check the Council's compliance against the SIPFA FM code. as Michelle says, we're happy to report that in our review, the council is meeting the requirements of the code and the standards, the 17 standards which it contains. We did identify some good areas of good practice. In particular, we were impressed with the strength around the business partnering arrangements in finance, and that was feeding through into sound financial planning and monitoring arrangements as well. The standards are, SITFA pitched them as being, they view them as being obligatory in terms of setting a minimum standard to meet council statutory requirements. So in providing our conclusions, I think we can provide some assurance that those standards are being met and exceeded in some places, which is a good place to be. Not all councils are necessarily in that good position. We did identify 4 areas where I think there was room for potential development. They're sometimes building on areas of strength. So the first of these was at service level, there were some pockets of really good use of benchmarking and similar sort of analysis to compare how the council is performing in its services against other councils, particularly around sort of the social care. We felt there was a bit of an opportunity there to learn a little bit from that and roll some more of that out across all of the council services to make sure that that becomes a key consideration across all of the council services on a slightly more consistent basis. That's not to say there was a significant problem there. It was just an opportunity to further develop. The question of longer term financial planning is one that SITFA put a lot of emphasis on, but when the rubber hits the road in terms of how councils go about actually applying that, there are legitimate sort of challenges to it, and councils therefore take a variety of different approaches. I think we discussed how this standard would be approached by Lincolnshire, and you obviously already have a medium-term financial plan with a reasonably good financial horizon. So that's not necessarily an area of weakness or anything like that. We did feel that there was an opportunity, given the uncertainties, to perhaps take a strategic view of what the financial picture might look like in the sort of 5 to 10 year time frame, the different scenarios that could unravel when things like business rates finally get around to being reviewed, what the impact of a new government might be, where money might come from, or indeed whether councils will be continuing to operate under constrained financial circumstances. We feel that there is some value in taking it, even if it's a high-level strategic approach to that, and we felt that the corporate plan with its longer-term horizon already might be a good vehicle for that. Again, these are just suggestions, but I think our experience has been that those councils who are currently struggling with the financial situations often are those who've struggled to deal with the sort of uncertainty in terms of, and have therefore sort of compounded their financial planning horizons to the point where they're only operating on a sort of hand-to-mouth year-to-year basis. Now, this council is nowhere near that position, but it does illustrate some value in having a bit of a further look out, even if that is slightly speculative. So I think we've come to a reasonable place on that particular recommendation. We have also looked at the consultation process with the local residents on the financial propositions, and I think the council is in there's a two-edged sword because of there aren't too many sort of points of stress within the financial planning, at least in the sort of year-to-year basis. It's sometimes difficult for residents to engage with the conversation. So we feel that in order for the council to sort of fully explore that standard of consultation with residents, there are probably opportunities to look at different ways of doing it, whether that be through local forums or other means. Yeah, I think that might link in again quite well to taking that longer term view or creating that longer term narrative about what the financial picture might look like. Again, suggestions about how the council could perhaps take some of those things forward. And the fourth area was about how key decisions are presented to members at committee, but also at full council. Again, the basic paperwork and the framework that the council uses is fine, it's adequate for purposes. We just felt that there's opportunity to perhaps expand the narrative around what the options are, other than the favoured option, what the other options that have been considered are. Again, it's just drawn from experience of other councils where perhaps options are presented as a sort of fait accompli. We felt that a well-rounded conversation around what the other options were and what the consideration process was is a benefit. And again, it's not an area of weakness, but it is an opportunity for the council to sort of push out from its already reasonably strong baseline on that front. So in terms of the actual document that we've got, we've setting out our exec summary on page 34 of your pack, which is page 4 of our report. The areas for development I've just talked through are on page 35. And then we move through onto our sort of summary assessment against the 17 criteria labelled A to Q. That's on page 36. And as you can see, we've flagged most areas as green, but the areas where we think there's a bit of room for development as amber. And I think it aligns fairly closely, or certainly is compatible with the council's own self-assessment, which again provides some reassurance on the council's own internal processes. I think that's probably as far as I need to go. Subject to any questions, I'm happy to field.
Thank you, Tom. Just going to hand over to Mark, who I think has got some questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Not a question to the presenter, but it's just a general comment about the report as submitted to us. I think it's very good. It shows that we're in a very good position, I think, which is pleasing, and certainly in a better position than many councils across the UK. It's nice to see that the independent audit by Grant Thornton has endorsed that to a great extent. I was quite pleased to see that there was 4 areas where perhaps some enhancement could take place, one of which is value for money, which is close to my heart. And secondly, option appraisal, which I think would be a very useful exercise. So always make sure that decisions are proven to be, the best ones, I think. I was very comforted with the report and its and the external audit. Just one question, though. I suppose it goes with it. I guess that it's fairly resource intensive, in doing all this work, and I just wondered whether we have any resource issue. I know there's issues associated with the external support from the consultants, but I just wondered whether internally we've got all the resources that we need, and ensuring that we are taking account of timeframes with existing resources and so on.
So in the finance team, you're talking about specifically. So that's not a question for Tom, question for me. I think overall our resources and our finance team are fine. I think the challenge we've had over the last year has been a number of changes of key personnel, and definitely the implementation of Business World has been a huge strain on our resource and the accounts work, which the committee are familiar with. So I think overall our resource is fine. I think we are going through a process at the moment, and one of the actions is on the action plan is about our workforce strategy. Is about making sure, whilst the total's probably right, the total quantum's right, it's just about making sure we've got the right skills in the right places in the team to undertake the work that we know we need to, and focusing on things like business intelligence, which will support best value and areas like that. There's not just our team that work on this. Obviously, Andrew McLean has got a team that deals with system and performance, so very much aligning our work with them in terms of that best value as well. So I think that the challenge with external audit is that that's a completely different challenge, and clearly that was a procurement that set out a stall that they've been required to do more work than they find they've bargained for. I think we're responding as well. It's not our intention to make our accounts boring, I'm sure. We follow the code of practice. That's our intention, to follow the code of practice, which I think we do, but I think there's just a general recognition that maybe that doesn't serve the purpose that's intended in terms of the public receiving those reports. It's challenging. I won't say it's not challenging. Audit have had challenges, which you've seen in Claire's reports last committee around the audit staff. But I think, you know, we're going through programmes like Introducing. We've got 2 starters coming over at the end of the summer from the National Graduate Scheme from the LGA. So we're doing everything we can, really. And it's not quite the same problem as the external audit market's having. And just on the best value stuff, which I know is dear to your heart, Councillor Allen, just out of interest, the Michael Gove issued a couple of weeks ago some draft statutory guidance around what the characteristics look like for best value. We've got a best value requirement set out in the Local Government Act, and obviously in response to some of the failures around the sector over the last year, that guidance has been published for consultation, so I can bring that back to committee once that's gone through its process, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm pleased and comfortable with your comments about the internal situation regarding resources. The external issues, I think, in terms of perpetually changing codes of practice and the difficulty in terms of satisfying some of them, and the greater difficulty that's becoming more evident in terms of the external resources being positioned to actually do the work, never mind wanting to actually make formal comment. I think is well understood, and I didn't want to belabor that point. In terms of value for money, yes, you're quite right. It's very close to my heart, although I'm not totally sure I would hold much weight in terms of whatever it is that Michael Gove has to say in terms of value for money, because I think the government's record in terms of finding value for money, probably in terms of its expenditure, is fairly poor. I shan't say any more. I'll get into trouble.
Thank you, Mark. So, Ian. Oh, okay, Stephen. And then...
Thank you. Sorry about that. I echo everything that Mark says about the report. It was very reassuring to see that the 2 reports go together and that the conclusions are similar. So that is grateful. I understand his question about the resources issue, because I must admit slippage is a problem, and my greatest concern is that we can be complacent saying we've got a good report, we've got a reason for slippage, but actually we've got to make sure that it doesn't actually keep on occurring, otherwise of course we're not getting there. But I appreciate that. My bit that I wanted to pick up was possibly on both page 27 and 59, which is really to do with the consultation and the feedback and communication with stakeholders, perhaps not necessarily always the businesses and large stakeholders, but the residents. And I'm just wondering whether currently we rely too much now on electronic surveys and so on, and that we don't actually get the sort of feedback that we want to do. I was asked, I think, over the weekend to look at one on highways, and it's very easy to go through. You're given 5 options, you're sometimes asked for a comment, sometimes not, and if you're filling it in and it says it's only 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you get to the last question, which it's possibly where you're wanting the in-depth sort of comments. Oh, I haven't got a lot of time for that. You press submit and off it goes. So I just hope that we can be looking at different ways and possibly going back to some of the old ways of face-to-face communication on those matters. But because it does worry me that sometimes we're not getting all the information in that we used to do. I appreciate that there are some generations and some people are very good at putting it all on electronic and social media type basis, but I don't think that goes for everybody.
I think Tom mentioned one of the challenges we've got on engagement on some of our budget setting, which is where we know we'd like to do better, is we haven't had anything too contentious in the budgets over the last couple of years, and I think that is a challenge because it's not people tend to speak when they've got something they want to speak about. I think the most contentious issue has been really about the level of council tax, and that's been really rehearsed at council around the need to offset some of the highways issues. I think highways do particularly use those things. I know they've been doing face-to-face consultation around North Icombe Relief Road. They've done 3 lots of engagement around that, and I had a leaflet through my door telling me where to go and see somebody face-to-face because I live in that area. We do some engagement through County News, which obviously gets pushed through the letterbox in county homes. Electronic is a way of trying to reach more people, but absolutely understand the need. And the forums, the Let's Talk Lincolnshire and things like that are ways we can look to do that as well.
Just if I come back quickly on that, and I do appreciate those things happen, it's not always quite as easy to get all the feedback on Snitterby Sand Lane, for instance, which might be full of potholes and probably passed by a few people on horses and bikes who don't necessarily feed in. So that's one concern I've got out in the rural areas. The other issue, though, I think, is parish councils. Too often we go to parish councils, or I have been anyway, and saying, look, this is your opportunity to comment, this is your opportunity to comment, and you're quite right. What we get back is, well, what's the point? It's going to go up by the maximum, we've got to pay the 5%, there's no point commenting because it's just going to go on. And that worries me a bit, that we do seem to have lost that sort of local comments being made and then being passed up. They mutter, they make the comments, but somehow they don't seem to be going up the chain because they believe that no one's going to take any notice of them.
So, again, this was the main comments were around our budget setting. When we set the budget, the council papers that went in February 23 included quite a lot of comments, I think, from parish councils, didn't they? And they were all presented to council. So they went up as high as I can take them in terms of our decision making. So we did get quite a lot of feedback from the parish councils through our normal engagement routes, and they were all included in the council papers that went into the budget decision.
Thank you, Michelle. Peter.
Yep, thank you. My concerns over the last year or so, and are now, is our financial long-term planning. Particularly, we've got a lot of uncertain times coming. We've had them for the last 12 months, 15 months. So my question, Michelle, is where do you think we are? I assume it's all a moving landscape, as it is with most businesses, to try and forecast where you're going to be in a few years. But it's that 5 to 10 years. It seems a long way away, but it soon creeps up on you. It's that 5 to 10 years down the line that concerns me. I refer obviously to inflation, and God knows none of us know where that's going to end up. Because we've had so many years. We had all those years of austerity, knocking people back, and now it's exploding because everybody wants more and more money in their wage back at the end of the month. So how accurate do you think you can be on a 5 to 10 year long-term financial planning?
So as part of our budget setting, we include a medium-term financial plan, which Tom referred to. We're quite prudent in that, in terms of we've allowed quite prudently for things like inflation and pay inflation, and we've increased our contingency over the last year or two to allow for that, particularly on things like education, transport, where we've seen the largest growth of cost. The scenario planning that Tom's suggested that we do would be helpful. I think we've got a large contingency, we've got a very good reserve, so our earmarked reserves, we've got a specific reserve around financial volatility, which is around 48 million, yes. And that's not been touched for the last year or two, and we've just delivered an underspend, obviously, for the last financial year without touching that as well. In terms of financial resilience, that puts us in a very good place to plan for the future. I think also recognised by Grant Thornton, the work that we do, quite detailed with the services, allows us to pick up on the nuances. So a lot of authorities just apply a blanket inflation across all of their contract costs. We do it as per service, and we do quite a lot of detailed work around that, so we understand where our pressure points are. I think what we could do more of is things like future decision making around council tax. That has a big impact. Future scenario planning around government funding. They've already talked about not being as generous with some of their funding as they have been over the last couple of years from the new government onwards. So that's the bit where we need to do a bit more of that scenario planning for the longer term, for beyond the 4 or 5 years. But in terms of our financial resilience, we're in the best place I think we can be in terms of the contingency and the reserves that we've got to support, giving us time to make any changes to our service delivery that we need to. But I think that's the recommendation from GT, that we do that bit of longer term scenario planning, and the main impact will be the government funding and the levels of council tax, I think.
Michelle, Ian.
Thank you, by the way, Michelle. I do like the accounts. I'm also used to working with the National Audit Office, where the default setting is it's not value for money until you prove otherwise. So what I would just follow up on Councillor's point and exactly what you just said. For me, the financial planning is not trying to work out what will happen. It's about, are we in a position to react quickly and detect it happening, and if so, what we were likely to do. With changes in government or different changes of focus, it's our ability to take control of that. Different pressures will pop up, but also different opportunities as well. But knowing what we will do at that point before we get there, it's kind of making a decision while we're sober, not trying to do it while we've had a few drinks. That was always the conversation with business continuity around Christmas planning. I'm a big fan of that. A couple of things on the report. That was one of them. The other one was about the skills survey that we're doing. I have a natural fear around these things, especially when people start filling them in. Overestimation, the so what question. Is it tied to my performance management? All those questions and more that flow into when we do this one. But the bigger question for me is around what we said about the workforce planning. What this might tee up is what's going to happen, what do we need, what have we got already, and to bring the news of, by the way, we have a massive gap and it's going to get worse. The question is how we're going to plug this and what investments that's going to take from this council to do that. Because it might be training, it might be right number of pulsers just in the wrong seats, whatever it might be. So I think there is a shift that once this survey comes out, and even if we get the accuracy we're hoping for, it's going to show a bit of a problem. So I think it's, for me, I think that's the hidden bit of this report. I think this is a good report. I think it's a great reflection on the team. But I think that's going to provide quite a few eye-opening moments, especially when you get it back in. I presume, so people self-filling in, and then is it being moderated?
So in terms of the skills assessment, I think you're absolutely right. I think I don't like to think of my team as pulses, but the right number of people, right number of people, probably the right quantum is just whether it's with the right skill set. So initially it was a self-assessment. We're undergoing that work at the moment, but appreciate that that's not the best approach. So it was the starting approach. We're getting some external support in from Gartner, who are people that work with us to do this sort of thing, and our HR team as well. So we're not just sitting trying to do it on our own. And I think there is a level of moderation that needs to happen. And we're going through that process at the moment. So it's not just, here's a list of skills you need. Have you got it? Yes, no. Okay, there's the training. Absolutely not. So we recognise that won't get us to where we need to get to with that. So it's a bit more dynamic than that. But it starts with self-assessment. And it's quite a long self-assessment as well. But and you've been part of that process, haven't you? So it's been worked on at individual team levels. But recognising the skill set going forward isn't just your standard transactional accounting kind of role that maybe the team have needed in the past.
And I think the consequence is the key thing about the honesty within that, because obviously you have the egos kick in, and you have the sentence, really, when you start seeing some of those surveys come back in. And I think it's a good start. I think the key thing for me that you just said was it's an iterative process. And if people feel it's an iterative process, we're on a one-off chance, you get a better chance of getting a better answer first time. But it will take time. So thank you.
Andrew, you'd indicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It is an assuring report. I guess you can't get better than a strong grip on financial management. It's not a bad endorsement for a head of finance. But the key thing for me is that I think it's a proper role of the leaders of a function to be critically self-aware. And we've had Grant Thornton confirm that we're critically self-aware in the right areas. And there will be more self-assessments externally validated in the future, because that is the right thing to do in a dynamic and well-led organisation, I think. I think it'll be particularly interesting, Michelle, to get your self-assessment of our value for money measures and strategies, etc. That will be a very interesting read, which Councillor Allen will pore over every word of, I'm pretty sure, because value for money is a very difficult concept to pin down sometimes. And your views on where we're at on that will be very, very useful. And let me stress that boring is good in financial terms.
If I can just follow on from that, so Tom can probably let you know that you're absolutely right. Leadership is massively important in terms of culture around financial management. Grant Thornton spoke to Mark Whittington as part of that, as part of his role as portfolio support to the leader, and he also spoke to all of the exec directors around their role in our financial management. I don't know if Tom, whether you can comment on that and the importance of that part of the work.
I think it's sometimes reflects a sort of stable financial position when people are, perfectly happy to be open and transparent and self-critical about things. I work with a wide range of councils. That culture is not necessarily to be taken for granted. So I think you're in a good position in terms of that transparency and that open dialogue. It's much more constructive and it's much safer for managing risk in the sort of medium to long term. Yeah, it's certainly reflected by the work we did.
Thank you, Tom. Any further questions? Just me? Yes, I've waited politely till last, as I should. Yes, just picking up on Tom's last point, really, Michelle, and it's something we've debated substantially over a period of time. But it's sort of, we're in a good position at the moment, but it's embedding that in the consciousness of the members. And any new members we get coming through, but it's getting that, like I said, the tone from the top, the culture. So, but it's something you've got to keep working on all the time, because we can't afford to let that slip. And I do think that at some point, and I'm looking at Claire perhaps here, it wouldn't be, and when we did moot this, if we had some training probably open to some of the scrutiny committee members as well, certainly OSMB, and the audit committee, that we look at some of the failures that have happened. And we did Northamptonshire, but some of the ones since have been jaw-dropping. And I'm sure their members didn't think they were going to get into that position at the time, but it was incremental, and by the time anyone tried to stop it, it was just way too late.
I think future work programme would be really helpful to have a look at some of those lessons learned. Some of the feedback I've had recently around Thurrock and Woking particularly, they focus on the investments that have been made that have gone wrong, but that's just a kind of outcome. Really, it's the core is about the governance and the transparency and the influence of the leadership and all of those things, which can change quite easily if you've not got the right kind of processes and systems and governance in place. So absolutely, I think it'd be useful to have that, and maybe look at the best value consultation that's come out as well.
Again, harking back to a level of reserves, it's always advisable to have a good level of reserves, because that always puts you in a good bargaining position or a good managerial position as you're moving forward. Because if you don't have them, that usually adds to the shocks of other things. And like you said, it's sort of these issues like poor investment things are merely a symptom of bad management from the top all across the board. Yeah. So that's great. And also looking at I think the options appraisal I would agree with. I think I'd agree with Mark on that. It's a very good idea. And the options appraisal in some more of the reports, not that it would be appropriate for all of them, but some more of them. And I'd agree with Michelle's comments on the barrier for money and looking at a self-assessment on that. I think liaising with stakeholders, particularly, I think the report alludes to the fact that, from a public point of view, it's often quite difficult for people to ascertain where responsibility lies and then connecting that with the expenditure involved in it. And also that may be complicated if we move forward to any devolution as well, when it might change again. So you know, the general public tend to look at the council as one amorphous body where it's usually made up of 3 layers or certainly 2 layers of administration. Okay, so we have our recommendations here, but again I think the report was very informative, and thank you to all our presenters and Tom and all the Michelle and her team for all the responses. So we're asked to scrutinise and comment on the progress reported against the CIPFA code, which we've looked through, and Grant Thornton's findings. So do I have a proposer and a seconder, please? All those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so if we could then move forward to item 6, which is the internal audit progress report. And I move over to Claire.
So good morning, everybody. As you've seen the report, it's a revised format from the one you've had previously from the previous head of internal audit. And the report also includes a change to the assurance ratings, which has been implemented from June, that just gives greater clarity and a little more alignment with other organisations within the public sector. It shares the performance against the audit plan and will include any serious deviations as they arise during the year. Pleased to say there's none at the moment, but it's early days. It includes a section on the post-audit feedback that we get, which is in a summary format. At the moment, it's an example because we haven't had any, but it will enable the committee to hold me to account for the quality of the service that we're delivering across all the clients as well as the county council. There is an update on the activity that's been happening with the team and an overview of the training that's been delivered within the audit team. There are examples of information to be shared as audits are completed and examples of any limited or no assurance ratings that are issued to give you that greater insight on areas that may be causing concern and allow you to see a summary of those collectively together. There is a high-level overview of the audits that are in progress, and again I'm aiming to carry 2 years' worth of work in there to provide the committee with an overview to aid your understanding of the work that we're developing and the progress that's being made as a result of the Get Well plan that's being implemented. Excuse me. I'm very happy to take any questions on the format of the report or the content of the report.
Thank you, Claire. Questions for Claire? Andrew.
Well, no comments on the detail, but it read encouragingly assuring, freshness, and of course you've set yourself up as a target now because your reports will need to follow this culture and theme, but I'm sure they will. But no, I thought there was a pretty impressive coverage of all the relevant areas, and it will of course be dynamic, and you will change it as needs require, etc. But to form a link with the previous report where Michelle personally was endorsed as having a strong grip, it's largely down to her. I get the feeling you've got a strong grip on this area as well.
Thank you very much. I like to think so.
Thank you. Ian.
I'll keep it succinct. I really like it. Let's do this.
What more can I say? Thank you.
Mark.
I don't know if I can be as succinct as that. I like the style very much, and I look forward to seeing this coming forward in the future, and hopefully with Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 having little in it.
Let's hope so. Thank you, Mark.
Again, Claire, from my point of view, again, the presentation and the strategy that you're looking at is very informative, and it's good to review as part of as a committee. So yeah, I think that's fantastic. Thank you. So we look forward to the one for the next quarter where we can look at the developments from now to then. So thank you. Any further questions for Claire? No, thank you. So we have the recommendation, which is that we note the report in its revised format and content, which we're very content with, and the progress and delivery be noted, and any actions taken as required. I think we're all content with that, Claire, so thank you. Could I have a proposer and a seconder for those, please? Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you very much. So if we then move on to item 7 of the agenda, which is the internal audit plan, and again I hand over to Claire.
Thank you. So again, revised format, linking back to the requirements of the public sector standards and allowing for a little more concise information to be shared. It's covering the key areas of conformance, conflicts, and how the plan has been developed for the year. It's covering a little bit of background on the team so that you're aware of what the team is made up of and how things may change as the year progresses. And you can see who is having the sole focus on delivering for the Lincolnshire County Council aspect of the plan. The final section covers the areas proposed to be audited and a brief scope and potential timescale for the delivery. If you use the two reports together, you can see that we are on track for our delivery to date. It's early days, but it's a nice reassuring start. I appreciate there's not a lot of particular focus in this, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have about the contents of the report.
Thank you, Claire. Ian.
Thank you. We had a quick chat before we started. There's a couple of areas on here that I think just for us to watch as we keep an eye on us over the next 6 months. One is we've always had challenges, which my colleagues have always asked about the question about resourcing level to deliver what we need to do. And therefore there's always been a bit of a slip and a roll and everything else to go around this. This also ties into the skills matrix conversation we were talking about with Michelle as well, which says, what do we want to do and why? And what skills have we got in the team and why not? And I think that's ties into the second piece, which is when we do these reviews, what assurance are we not getting? Because it's always quite easy to get false assurance at this sort of scale, at this sort of level. When you start having a look at things, for example, the supporting family grants and all that sort of stuff, it's a great, okay, what assurance picture are we able to build up? But specifically, what can we not conclude on? So I think for me, good start, fantastic, let's have a look. I think that bit about the resourcing, what can we provide assurance on, what we can't provide assurance on. The last bit is then, if we had this, we could provide additional assurance over here. So that gap for me is just as important about what we do provide assurance on, please. If I can read that from the reports, perfect.
I think as it develops, we're trying very much to get the scoping right in the first place so that the terms of reference are very deliverable. And then that, as a result of that, will exclude some areas naturally, but we'll also apply that on a risk basis. So it will be easy to report what we haven't been able to look at. There is also, in our step process that we deliver, there's also a point where once the team have gone out and had some initial discussions, there's those regular touch points with myself so that we're able to identify any potential areas that we haven't considered that we need to, or areas that we think actually we maybe need to turn our focus elsewhere. So I'm hoping that will naturally come within the steps behind the scenes that we're delivering as a team.
Thank you, Ian. Any further questions for Claire? Yes, Claire, I was just looking through the 23-24 plan. Obviously, as members, the homeschool transport issue, I think Mark's referred to already, is a thorny one on a practical level, and the resources to that are key. And looking at the value for money of that, as we debated earlier on, it can be quite problematic. It's, the business world, again, key one, just to make sure that our internal controls regarding the payroll and the financial systems and HR are on trend. And also the care assessments, which we've asked Glenn about before, I mean, in terms of adult social care, obviously this is would include both sections, presumably adults and children, would it?
Initially, we're just focusing on adults.
It's the care plan, the adjustment to the care plans and also the funding of that that's a you know, needs good monitoring as we're going along. Okay, because that's a financial threat to us if that wasn't functioning correctly. So yeah, I think that's good. And also sickness absence, I think, is going around at other organisations. I think that's an issue at the moment, or potentially is, with you know, the after effects of anecdotal. I know quite a few people have got sort of the viral infections over the last few months that have pretty well laid them very low, and that's having a. I'm talking about self-employed people here, so obviously you've got no choice but to try and carry on. But it's you know, as we get somewhat, I know we've got a younger workforce, but as your workforce ages, that gets to be more of an issue as well, as you get people who are you know, not such of a younger age group. So yeah, that's very interesting, and thank you for that. I think so. We have any further questions for Claire on that one? No, thank you. So we have the I think we've made our comments and raised issues on the 23-24 plan. So do I have the proposer and seconder for the recommendation, please? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Ian, okay. Thank you. Okay. So if we can then move forward to item 8, which is Diane, and we're looking at the counter fraud work plan for 23-24.
Thank you. Good morning. Yes, I'm bringing you the counter fraud work plan. The report sets out the upcoming plans for our counter fraud work, and it follows on from the annual report which we brought to Audit Committee at the last meeting, where I think there was some recognition that there was further work to do around counter fraud. The report I'm bringing you sets out a focus on targeting our resources towards the risk areas, and our strategic aims are set out on page 106 of your pack. So we're quite clear where we want to align to recognise best practice whilst meeting the council's needs. Clear priority for us is to recruit staff. We've touched on recruitment earlier. Clear priority to recruit staff to support delivery, and also communication of messages. So we have a clear tone from the top. People understand what the fraud risks are, and a real focus on sort of activity planning to deter fraud in the future. So that's a real shift from just a focus on investigations towards some real proactive work. And the plans in the appendix set out how we intend to do that. And we're due to report back to the Audit Committee in November. That will bring our fraud risk assessment, and that will steer and lead the activity planning that we then have in track to deliver in terms of the counter fraud work. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dad. Andrew.
Yeah, I've sat on audit committees for about 18 years now, and this is always a fruitful area, particularly in the NHS, where the threshold for getting excited goes up and up and up. And I don't know whether that's because it's not worth it looking at or because I can't get the staff. You've declared you're going to invest in the investigation. You're going to go from one person to 3 people, broadly. And I'm reminded of a conversation with somebody who worked for HMRC once, that she bemoaned the fact she's been made redundant at a 50,000 salary, and yet the average return on each salary was 10-fold, $500,000. Because the more you look, the more you find.
Yes.
Is that part of your rationale, that you think these posts will be self-financing because you will head fraud off at the pass and reduce it, and therefore be a payback on investment?
In part, I think if you invest, if you have a strong tone from the top and you're setting out in terms of zero tolerance towards fraud, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're taking action. And if you don't have investigators in place to be able to do that, it's very difficult. So that actually having the posts there to investigate where fraud is found is crucial. Wherever possible, we always attempt to make recoveries. It's not always feasible if the funds have gone and there are no recourse to be able to reclaim those funds, but we will always make attempts to do that. Equally, the investing on the counter-fraud side of things is just as important. So it will free up the counter-fraud staff away from investigations that they're currently focused on to be able to look at some of the more proactive work, to go out and actively look for fraud. And in doing so, where you actively look for fraud, inevitably you're going to find some, and you need that resource there to be able to do something about it when you do find it. So it's a two-way process, really. But say that the real steer is for us to try and focus on prevention in the first place, because investigation is an expensive commitment.
And we'll see the fruits of your further investment in a year's time.
Certainly hope so. It's one of those difficult ones. How do you quantify fraud stopped? It is going to be a difficult one to measure. I think that's something to have some conversations on in terms of how we manage it, or how we would measure fraud stopped. A mandate fraud is quite easy to quantify because you can have a look at the next payment that would have gone out. Some of the fraud's a little more tricky to quantify, but certainly, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Ian and then Mark. Thank you.
Sorry.
There we go. I've headed up multiple loss prevention teams, retail and a few other areas as well. And that bit about trying to chase the money is quite hard, because if that's your justification, it becomes an issue. Deterrent is important, as we've talked about. Quantifying the saves is really, really hard. Trying to identify what you've not allowed to go through is very, very difficult. And we shouldn't be focused on that, because actually it is, that one part of the story is great, what you've got that back in and everything else. But even then, when you go into recoveries, you don't always recover whatever the amount is there. We should avoid going for the glory shot of trying to say, look, we've had this one big number, that's great, that justifies our existence from a long point of time. This isn't about this. I think the key thing for me when I look at this and look at the plan is it's the important next level that matters to me. The activities. I want to see the activities. The plan is too high level for me at this point in time, if I'm honest. I need to see the detail. I need to see where we're focusing our efforts. I need to see the skill sets. Sorry to be repetitive. This is about as boring as his accounts. I'm still going to be boring about skill sets. To actually say, how are we going to prevent? Where are we focusing? How are we focusing? So when we start having a look at the way that fraud is being conducted, it's all in different pockets, different services that we provide. How would you do this? Therefore, have we got the balance set? Because that ties into the recruitment process. Because you're trying to find 3 people now to go into this. Where are we going to find these people and why? Because the answer is it's no good bringing in investigators if they've got the wrong skill sets for where we're going to be taking them over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think for me, great high-level positioning. I think the key thing for me is I'd like to get some assurance on how that's going to physically manifest itself. Because also part of this is us not trying to go for the glory shot. It's about giving that permission to you to say, look, this is the right team, this is what it's out there, it's doing a good job, and we can demonstrate it to the extent that we can, without having to chase down saves, because that drives the wrong behaviour in my view. But that all comes back to that same point I just discussed. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. So we are due to report back to Audit Committee in November with fraud risk assessments, and that in itself will drive the activity, and that's where you'll get the detailed planning. At the moment, so we're quite new in terms of reforming the team at the moment. In terms of the skill sets, what we're looking for is not only investigators, but also the knowledge and counter-fraud awareness so that they can help manage the risks of the organisation. And when they're not investigating, there'll be an expectation that any new recruits will be supporting on that counter-fraud messaging as well.
Thank you, Chairman. My comments are very similar to Mr. Halby's. It's good to see that the team's aiming to grow the team, because that provides lots of opportunity then. Mr. Halby was quite right in terms of let's have the right skill set to actually make the best use of those resources. I look forward to the November report, I think, in terms of where we are then and what we're the detail of what it is that we're aiming to do. Although I would say that the priorities that you've identified on page 4 of the report seem to be the obvious ones and the ones fundamental to fraud and its deterrence and indeed prevention. I think that is something that we mentioned. You know, prevention sometimes is quite important, as well as tackling people that have done the business as opposed to hopefully not wanting to do the business. I think the other thing that's of interest, and we have talked about it in the past, is the perhaps sometimes the difficulty in bringing things to a full conclusion. You know, either in terms of somebody ending up in court and maybe in prison. Never mind some money back to us, you know, in the cases where that is appropriate. And there's two issues there. One is the police, and I think they're interrelated. One is the police support in terms of actually bringing things to conclusion where it's appropriate that the police are involved. And secondly, and I think you've identified that, so we look forward to comments on that, is the speed of doing it. Because I think it's, you know, if we're talking about effectiveness, it's always better, I think, to, you know, have rumours of somebody being caught and then having action quickly following that up, rather than it being 1 year or 2 years downstream where people have forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of that, we're starting to build some links with the police. We can't influence the police resource, naturally. That's for them to manage that resource. Nevertheless, we are starting to see some progression. One of the big cases that made a referral on probably 2-3 years ago now is actually due in court this week. So we are starting to see progress. They certainly, we were concerned that, you know, it might reach time barred threshold, but they are taking action. Certainly on the larger cases, there's some action there. So that's a positive move. In terms of speed, the investigations probably have two prongs to it. One is the immediate internal disciplinary process, which means we stop the fraud quickly, and if it's, you know, a fraudster that's working in the council, if it's an internal fraud, not always internal, if it were to be an internal fraud, we can take action in terms of a disciplinary process before it goes through the court process, so that doesn't preclude that. And again, there's different threshold in terms of proof there, as a burden of proof there as well. So we can take some action even if we're waiting for the police. So we're not completely reliant on the police on that. Although naturally, you know, we would like to take proper sanctions and redress.
Thank you for that. Yes, that point is acknowledged.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ian. Just one further point, Dan. Obviously, you know, as the forward team go around, if they notice any, if they can advise on any systems improvements, I take it that just done as a matter of course. And not only that, but are we finding a trend towards being victims of the authority being a victim of potential frauds, if you like, that are generated way outside the authority and that are conducted in the ether rather than by a local person, which makes it substantially more challenging, does it not?
Internal control. Well, I'll take the first point first. Internal controls. Certainly, the counter-fraud team will support and work closely with the internal audit team as well. Where we have investigations, we always look to see if there are any lessons learnt, what we can do to prevent reoccurrence. That's a really critical part of the investigation. It's not just stopping it, it's stopping it from happening again. So in terms of the controls environment, yes, certainly we input to that. In terms of the wider targets, cyber fraud, cyber risks are ever present. It will always be a red risk. The changing nature of that is constant. Certainly we found with the police involvement, where we've had cyber frauds overseas, it makes it incredibly difficult for them to target and take action. But the key thing is stopping it and making sure we've got that awareness. Cyber fraud, for example, you're always one click away from a fraud. You know, we recognise that, and good communications are essential. David Ingham's team, he reported last time to Audit Committee, really good control on the cyber risks. I'm sure he's not complacent any more than we are. We're always getting messages coming out internally along those lines.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah, it's an ever-moving feast, isn't it? So you've got to be on your toes at all times. So, like you said, it's a multidisciplinary thing. It involves a IT, a finance team, and the people just on the ground who can probably spot maybe a colleague not acting the way they ought to, or something like that. It's often small things that brought to people's attention quite early. So thank you for that, Mark.
Just following your point, where do the skills in the county exist that deal with cybercrime? Is it partly in your group, or is it IT? Is it shared?
I suppose it's multidisciplinary. In terms of cybercrime, you've got the information governance team that's put strong messages out in terms of the activities on that, but we will be liaising quite closely with them. When I worked for the council previously, we had some really good relationships with the information assurance team. And equally, we have to rely on support from the tech side as well of things. So it's a multidisciplinary one. There isn't a single one-stop shop. We will have to work and build on that a holistic approach, really.
Thank you, Diane. Any further questions for Diane? No, thank you. So, members, we have the recommendation to review and approve the counter fraud work programme. We don't want to promote counter work, I don't think. The counter fraud work programme for 23-24. So could I have a proposer and seconder, please? Thank you. And all those in favour of the report. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So, members, if we could move on to our final item 9, which is the work plan. And I know we've discussed this over the last couple of meetings, particularly in terms of having some sort of having the attendance of Glenn Goward from the Director of Adult Social Care as well in terms of market supply and other issues. So I'll pass over to Claire. Are you?
Thank you. So yes, we've got Glenn coming to the September meeting as requested back in March, April time, to share his thoughts that sat behind the entry onto the Strategic Risk Register. And then we've in the same September meeting, we've also got the Corporate Risk Management Report, Progress Report that will come. And I'm hoping that will then drive the committee's thinking around the strategic deep dive that happens at the November meeting in relation to the risks. So hopefully that will inform your thinking and enable you to put that in so that we can let officers know what it is you would like to discuss in November. And then things follow, as it stands at the moment, things follow the similar format throughout the year. And the Chair and Vice Chair and I have said we will sit down and review this just to make sure it still meets the requirements of the committee and that we are sharing the right information with you at the right time. So there will be more to come once those conversations have concluded.
Thank you, Claire. Any questions for Claire or any comments on the work plan? I think it's fairly sort of transparent. We've it's the usual, well, the usual format. Obviously, we have a certain amount of things we have to look at at a certain time, but I think that at the moment covers what we've discussed previously. So, do I have a proposer and a seconder for the work plan, please? All those in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you. Relatively concise one today. So thank you for everyone for their attendance. I do wish that everyone has a very enjoyable summer recess for the month of August, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in September, and thank you once again. Thank you.